So our next speaker is the president of 2TM Consulting Engineers, a pavement engineering company providing design, evaluation, forensic services, and litigation support. Graduate of Texas A&M University, received both bachelor's and master's degrees in civil engineering, specializing in pavements and materials. He's practiced pavement engineering nationally and internationally for the past 30 years and was the manager of the FHWA's Southern Region Long-Term Pavement Performance Program. He has been heavily involved in applying his pavement engineering experience to successfully complete design-build projects and conduct pavement forensic investigations for owners and contractors. And I have to say, Larry came up with this idea and said, we need to bring in a pro consultant here that understands how the game is changing and how things are transitioning from DOT design to consultant design. And Mr. Martin here, Mr. Tim Martin, was the perfect candidate to do so. So if you will, please help me welcome Tim.
Thanks. I want to thank John and Larry for inviting me. When I came in this morning, I originally had this presentation set up more for concrete paving, issues and the like. And I realized, wait a second, this is IGGA. They're more interested in what happens to grinding and grooving. So I actually went back spent about an hour, shuffled things around. So bear with me if this doesn't go quite as good as I hoped, but hopefully you'll find it informative. I'm going to talk about what's changing with our client and the situation. We're changing the procurement and contract processes. There's changes in specifications, test methods, materials. Probably the most important one on here, I think, is actually the change in the experience of clients and contractors. When I'm talking about clients, I'm really talking about owners in this case. And then finally, in this presentation, I'm going to talk about maybe some things that we should consider moving forward. So everybody's familiar with different types of contracts. There's design, bid, build, procurement process. It's the traditional one. There's construction management with fee or at risk. And there's also design build, which is gaining ground. Those are the ones that I've been involved with mostly for some larger tech stop projects as a design engineer. Why did we migrate this way? Well, with design build, there's a quicker turnaround time from the actual design to actual final completion. That reduces risks on inflationary issues with materials. But I think we've lost a little bit of some things when we've gone to design build. One of the things is qualifications-based selection in your engineer. The other thing is, the thing that I find myself caught behind the 8 ball in a lot of these design build jobs is we're providing a design for the contractor that then to bid on that's based on maybe 30%. So it's not 100% design. So if there's any changes to the conditions at the site or anything else that are unknown, that can cause some major issues. And that's usually captured in a risk register, which usually increases bid prices. So I've encouraged TxDOT to actually provide more and better information in the solicitation to help us out. But those are some of the things. But all of those contracts usually come with a 1 to 2 year warranty. But one point I want to make on this is that doesn't mean that after 2 years you can walk away and think, oh, I'm never going to be sued. I was involved in a local project here, not too far away, a facility that sued about 7 years afterwards. All the quality control, quality assurance testing passed. They had all their incentive bonuses, paid for in the project, but it still got wrapped in a litigation. So I'll talk a little bit more about that case later on. But there's also capital maintenance agreements. In TxDOT, these are usually involved with concessions where tolls are involved, where the contractor gets revenue from those tolls, but then after 5 years, the state can take them back. And there are 3 5-year extensions in that. And usually there are performance criteria for these capital maintenance agreements. There's surface distress. There's friction, which is probably the most important that would, require grinding, but then also ride quality, which would include some grinding. And this data is collected annually. There's the initial construction IRI that you're supposed to hit, but when we're talking about these long-term performance contracts, the data is collected annually. It's usually summarized in 0.1 mile increments. But a lot of times the surface friction if you're talking 0.1 mile, you might only have 1 point or 2 to represent that entire length. So if you came out and tested again and got different points, you might get a different surface friction number. So now I'm going to talk about specifications. Why do we have specifications? Well, from the owner side, it tells, the contractor, this is what I want. Most of the specifications are method-based specifications that specify what materials you're going to use, how you're going to do your quality control and quality assurance testing, and also the means and methods that you're going to use for those. From the contractor's view, that helps him understand how he can bid. It also has payment mechanisms. So for ride quality incentives or disincentives, there's also strength, percent within limits, and the like. But the real transition that we're trying to go for, just with our performance engineered mixtures, we want performance-based specifications. I think that's going to change some of the liability actually to the contractor when he's, totally responsible for his own means and methods for those. So what are some of the common specification problems? Well, there are, the precision and bias in these test methods that we use, whether it's, for the actual testing of the concrete materials, or in this case, friction testing, there is variability in this. And as I mentioned, the skid trailer is picking up a discrete point. But we need to understand these precision and biases that are in these specifications, because I've seen certain areas where they didn't meet the friction requirement. Probably the most important thing on any of these pavements is the aggregate type that's there for surface friction. These can sometimes cause issues. The ride quality, there's many different ways. There's a California profilograph. I think we're not going to see that much anymore, but the standard is pretty much inertial profilers. There's also the dipstick for floor flatness and levelness, if you guys get involved in any of those. But with the inertial profile, I was out on a flexible pavement project, and the long-term performance criteria was 95 IRI. And that, I think the FHWA at about 95 IRI is where they classify a good pavement to a fair pavement in the ride quality. And I think 170 IRI is where they go from fair to poor. But TxDOT usually requires 95 IRI long-term. And when I looked into the contractor who, was responsible for this maintenance agreement and figuring out, why there were some of these failures, I was trying to think, well, what is the precision and bias out here? Well, these profilers, you're measuring with a layer. I mean, it can measure down to a micron with these lasers. But when they go to a calibration site, every profiler is supposed to be calibrated at these sites, as well as the operator is supposed to be certified. But what does that mean? Well, what I found out was a vendor, as long as he's within plus or minus 3 IRI at the calibration site, he passes. So that means for these annual data collections, they get a different data collection vendor each year. You can get maybe a 6 IRI delta in your measurement. That doesn't even take into consideration the precision of the measurement or wheel wander. And as Tom Van Dam did a very good job of talking about the curling and warping effects, if you're doing a jointed concrete pavement, the time of day you do that IRI measurement can have a big effect. It's usually coldest, at the break of dawn, where it's usually curling, and then late in the afternoon when it goes into a warping phase. So the optimal time would be in that neutral temperature gradient within the concrete to get the best ride. So if you measure it at the wrong time and fail, just wait a while and measure it again. Maybe you'll pass. So just some things to keep considerate. And what happens when some of these acceptance testing don't meet the requirements or the target value? Obviously, the owner and contractor are going to get into a dispute. If it's a false rejection, meaning that somehow it failed to meet the mark, but it was, measured improperly, that's costly to the contractor. But if it's falsely accepted, that's costly to the owner. And then the sampling issues, as I mentioned, especially with surface friction, the points that you collect can have an issue. So just one other thing I wanted to talk about specifications here is, there's also different changes in materials that are happening on to us. There's a whole host of, a handful of different patching materials. I guarantee you over the next 30 years, somebody's going to market other patching materials that come out here. And when DOTs or agencies look at these patching materials, they're really wanting to know how good is this going to perform. It's usually a durability issue, but nobody actually looks at how grindable is this material. So that's something that I think, could be done in the future. But so I wanted to talk about experience. And I think this is the biggest issue that I see in the cases that I get involved with, that there's inexperience on one side or maybe both that causes misunderstandings and then litigation. Now, I just have a slide that says client. I'm not going to put any names or any other things out here. But some of the clients that I've worked with, such as the local agency that's over there, I think they had limited experience. And I think as we look at the job market right now and have a harder time, staffing up with experienced people, agencies are no different. A lot of times agencies lose qualified staff to, the commercial consulting area. And a DOT is big enough and has a deep enough bench that a lot of that experience is maintained and retained, and they have the experience to deal with it. But smaller local agencies where there's a guy that's maybe, or a girl that's wearing 3 different hats and doing multiple jobs, and that person leaves, that's usually it. But in this particular case, the reason I'm bringing up this project is because there was a lot of surface erosion out at this facility. And when I first looked at the pictures, I thought it was an asphalt pavement. The surface texture, all the paste was gone, all the aggregate was exposed. There were some pop-outs of the aggregate. There was pop-offs of the transverse grooves, and it was total full of rubber. So you already probably know it's a runway. But when I looked at that, I thought, gee whiz, what is this? And it took me a while till I saw the wings and further out photos that, yes, this is an actual rigid pavement that's out there. But what's going on? Well, the litigation of the plaintiff was saying that it's defective concrete. Well, as I mentioned, all the quality control, quality assurance testing, we looked at the petrography, no issue. Couldn't understand why there's issues out there. But the one correlation was it was all in rubber removal areas. And when we started looking at those records, we found that they were using 40,000 PSI water pressure. Then they were going out every 2 to 3 weeks. And sometimes when they did go out, they'd make multiple passes because they started to change the P501 specifications or the FAA specifications regarding surface friction. Usually the FAA doesn't recommend going out, but maybe once every 2 months in the highest trafficked areas. And then I think the requirement was for 95% removal of rubber, where they upped it to 99, which is why the guys were doing multiple passes. Well, they basically blasted the surface clean. Now, the solution, the reason I'm talking about this case, was grinding. Grind it smooth. Put a new surface on there. You could even do like a next generation concrete surface, which I like because it's smooth on the side and you get the grooves. So you can do it transverse and get your transverse grooves. I thought this was a perfect solution and a cost-effective solution. But the airfield didn't like that. They basically removed 3 inches of concrete in the keel section and put a 3-inch SMA right in the center. Something that they're going to have maintenance for the next, every 7 or 8 years, they're going to have to replace that SMA. And I don't know if they've changed the rubber removal processes or not, but that's a major issue as well. Where was I going with that? The specifications. So the P501 specification and the DoD specifications only allow 10% of the surface area to be ground. They also keep the depth of grind down to 1/4 inch max. And when I get involved in these cases and I'm reading these specifications, sometimes for the first time, I'll admit that, it's always an educational experience. I look at it and I say, why is this in the specification? How did this get fossilized? And when I start talking to the parties that should know, nobody knows. I had the privilege of working with Toy Poole while I was at the construction CTL group, Construction Technology Laboratories. He had 30 years experience at the Corps of Engineer lab in Vicksburg at the concrete laboratory. And he had about 45 years before he retired recently. And I would ask him these questions. And he was actually one of the few sources that could give me some of the answers. He said, the reason the 1/4 inch grind got fossilized in some of these specifications, most people think thickness. And that's not necessarily the case. And in this particular runway, it had 19 inches of concrete. And if you actually looked at the new FAA design standards, the accelerated facility at Turner Fairbanks, or not Turner Fairbanks, at the Hughes Research Center in Atlantic City, they've changed their models. So you're actually getting about 2-inch thinner pavements on your runways is adequate. So you had an extra 2 inches you could have ground if you wanted to. And obviously there's grade issues. But he said the reason that the 1/4 inch grind is there is because I think on the military contract, when they milled greater than that, a lot of their nominal size aggregate and larger aggregate particles were exposed. And because it had a poor paste aggregate bond, they got all these sliver spalls and everything else going in. And the surface started rattling. Well, to me, if that made it in the specification, there should have been a caveat that if you have a very good paste aggregate bond, you should be able to grind to China, as long as you're meeting the thickness requirements out there. The other thing that I heard about the 10% grind surface area was visual acuity. Well, I don't know anybody that's landing on a taxiway or an apron. So if you wanted to grind 100% there, you shouldn't be allowed to. But then if you're going to grind the whole surface, well, the whole surface is going to look the same anyway. So the visual acuity thing should not be an issue. I can't verify, these assertions that have been made on why that specification is there, but that's just one of the things that I get concerned of. There's many other stories if you want to hear other client issues or owner issues. There was another one regarding pop-outs, but this doesn't have to deal with grinding. But on the other side, there's inexperience in contractors. And I think we may see some of this happen as more and more people get in the industry, especially with the $1 trillion infrastructure spending bill. But I had, one client that was doing a taxiway for an Air Force job. And the issue was that the flexible paving contractor came, and when he was compacting it with the steel wheel roller, the vibratory roller, he basically rubbleized the outside 2-inch edge. He rode up on it and pulverized it. And so the Air Force was like, hey, you got to replace these slabs. And they thought, wait a second, this is 75 feet wide, a couple inches either side. It shouldn't make an issue. Let's just cut it and go. And they accepted that solution. They also had mortar-rich layer on the sides, and grout got caught in the box as a pocket. But it was very thin. And I said, you could probably just grind that off as long as you get your cross slope right. So we were talking about maybe getting the Air Force to accept 20% grind on the surface, which was already pushing the envelope over the, well over the 10%. And they accepted that. Now, the contractor, I have no idea why he did this, but he hired a LiDAR contractor to come up with a grinding plan. They wanted a grinding plan and everything else. And LiDAR, again, lasers, micron, distance, everything else measurement. They showed what the accuracy was. But if you don't tie it properly into the base stations, you're going to be off. Well, I come in after the grinding was finished, expecting to see 20% grinding. The entire surface of the taxiway had been ground. So I don't know how that happened, but hey, booyah for the grinding guys. They got 100% on that. But the Air Force accepted it. And so I'm hoping that we can push for allowing more and more of these treatments on the airfield side as we go on. So what's the way forward for this? Well, be familiar with the precision and bias of any of the specifications that you're using. I think a lot of people overlook that. Something just doesn't meet the target value, and all of a sudden people say, oh, it's failed. You got to do something different. We need to update and keep specifications current. I know Gary Mitchell does an excellent job of dealing with that with the specifications, for the P501, for FAA, and also the DoD concrete paving specification. But I think there's room to add a lot of these other items into the specifications and keep pushing to allow greater amount of grinding, in at least the aviation side of things, in the depth of grind. And then utilize the partners here. I think we already do. That's why we're here today. But there's great resources at IGGA. I know I rely on Larry quite a lot if I get something that I haven't seen before. But the ACPA, the National Concrete Tech Center, and even NRMCA can be here to help educate your client. When usually a contractor calls me and says, I've got a problem, blah, 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 the first thing I usually ask them is, are you a member of IGGA or ACPA? Because that is a valuable resource. You know, a lot of the agency folks, you know, are, you know, former agency like Larry and others are working now for these agencies. And there's nobody better to actually try and mediate a dispute early on before it goes litigation than the folks here with these agencies. Now, obviously, that doesn't always succeed, and now, you know, I'm retained for those kinds of projects. But I think the research that's being done by these agencies, and the more we can do to educate the client as well as ourselves, the better off we'll be in mitigating a lot of the litigation that goes on today. So with that, there's a picture of my designated driver. He's always reliable. But if there's any questions, I'll be happy to answer them.
Do we have any questions for Tish? Well, excellent job. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Appreciate it.